Good afternoon and good evening and good morning to our friends in New Zealand and Australia. I'm Zev Yaroslavsky, and on behalf of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, Janice Kaminer-Resnick, who is traveling tonight, and myself, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's America at a Crossroads program. Tonight is our approaching our fourth anniversary of America at a Crossroads. As our audience is aware, this is our second webinar of the week, and we are grateful for your interest and loyal viewership. Tonight, we're being joined by the Atlantic's David Frum, a political commentator and guru par excellence. He'll be talking about politics, elections, wars, and America standing in the world. Before we get to tonight's program, I'd like to share some news on the America at a Crossroads lineup front. On Wednesday, of next week at 5 p.m. Pacific time, please join us as we welcome CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt. He will be in conversation with Larry Mantle on the topic of anti-Semitism, hate, and bigotry in America today, an update. On Sunday, March 24th, please mark your calendars on this, March 24th at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time, our guest will be Israel's 12th Prime Minister and former Mayor of Jerusalem, Ehud Olmert. Ehud has been outspoken on the Israel-Gaza crisis in recent weeks, and his appearance will be timely and enlightening. Starting tomorrow, you can register for Olmert's appearance with us, which again will be on March 24th, a Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. To our international audience, please take note that the United States is now on daylight savings time. That is to say, we moved our clocks forward 1 hour this past weekend. So if you haven't moved your clock, please be sure your time calculation takes our time change into account. Finally, hold the date for our fourth anniversary program on Wednesday, March 27th at 5 p.m. as we welcome Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post. Jennifer was our very first America at a Crossroads guest, and she has joined us each year on our program's anniversary for a program entitled America Then and Now, Where Are We Headed? Our moderator will be Warren Olney. Speaking of Warren Olney, let me introduce him now. Warren is a decades-long American broadcast journalist. He was the host and executive producer of the nationally syndicated public radio program To the Point. Prior to that, he hosted KCRW's very popular local public affairs show, Which Way, LA. He has won just about every broadcast journalist award, oftentimes more than once. He remains one of the most respected in his profession and has been part of this program's team since its inception 4 years ago. And he will introduce tonight's guest. Warren?
Zev, thank you very much for that very kind introduction to me. I'm very happy to be able to introduce David Frum. But first, David, I want to address you directly and extend my sympathies and those of America at a Crossroads for the death of your daughter just a few weeks ago. That is a very, very difficult thing to deal with. And I know that our audience will share that concern and recognize that you're taking the time and making the effort to be with us tonight, despite having to live with that tragedy. So thank you very, very much. Before we get underway, it's wonderful to have you, and you're very generous with your time, and thank you so much.
Thank you. I will indulge myself for one moment on that. There are in many families generational differences over some of the most fundamental questions of Jewish identity. I'm very proud to say that my daughter was someone who lived in Israel for 4 years and was a stalwart supporter always of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. She was not a religious person, but she was never one to back away from her people when her people were under fire.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's quite a tribute from a father, and something that every child, the sort of thing that every child would like to hear. So thank you again for being with us. So let me do an introduction. David Frum currently is senior editor at The Atlantic. He's a contributor to MSNBC. He was a speechwriter for George W. Bush. He wrote a book about it called The Right Man. He has written at least 9 other books, including Trumpocracy in 2018 and Trumpocalypse in 2020. David, you didn't call either of those books The Wrong Man, although you might have done that, but you didn't. Anyway, welcome again to being on our program. We're delighted to have you.
Clay Aiken, the singing legend who became a great podcaster, asked me if I had any plans for a third Trump book. And I said, I did not. And he said, well, if you do, I have the title for you. I was curious to hear what it would be. And he answered, Trump carceration. So we'll see if that comes to
All right. Well, hopefully we can get through the program before anything happens beyond where we're sitting. Let me start with what happened last night when both President Biden and former President Trump won enough delegates to their party conventions to assure that their renominations for president will in fact happen. So it's been said we're going to see a rerun of 2020, but of course a lot has changed since 2020. So what do you think this campaign is going to be like? How much is it going to be like 2020? How much is it going to be different?
Well, let me say something at the beginning about this idea of a rerun election. You'll hear people often say on the cable shows and other places that they're dissatisfied with this presentation. They would like a different kind of choice. And I struggle with that because these choices, this is not programming. This is not entertainment. This is not something that is algorithmically selected for your enjoyment. You are not an observer of this contest. You are a participant. This is your country. These people work for you, or they should. These are the two major choices. And whatever you think of the choice, I would hope that every patriotic citizen would understand the choice is clear and your obligation is clear. And it's not a matter of what you think of it and how you enjoy it or whether it amuses you. You have an obligation, and that is to defend the democratic system in your country. And look, I agree with President Biden on perhaps 4 issues out of 10, on a good day, maybe 5. But that's not the question on the ballot in 2024. It's not about student loans. It's not about the rate of spending. It's not about debt management. It is about preserving the things that keep America a democratic republic. And on that question, and keeping America embedded in its global alliance systems, on that question and those 2 questions, President Biden is in the tradition of every president dating back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Donald Trump is not.
Well, let me just ask you a question about your contention that this is your choice, because it seems to me the parties have dictated the choices. That the Democrats didn't put anybody on the ballot at all, except for President Biden. Although, of course, there have been some secondary candidates that haven't amounted to much, and there has been this non-committed vote because of the war in Gaza. The Republicans, on the other hand, did have some contests going on, but very few. And of course, Nikki Haley really didn't have a chance, even though she hung in there till the very end. So to what extent is this really the choice of the voters?
Well, this great lumbering mechanism of democratic selection has many, many pieces to it. And presidents often face primary challenges when they dissatisfy their party. Jimmy Carter faced one in 1980 from Ted Kennedy. George H.W. Bush faced one in 1992 from Pat Buchanan. And presidents, when they face these choices, of course, are gravely weakened and often then lose the next election, as Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush both did. So there's a kind of potential choice that happens where the failure or the unwillingness of people to coalesce around an alternative to the president is a ratification of the president. There were people who tested this, like Dean Phillips, the congressman from Minnesota, not a negligible figure at all, but Dean Phillips became convinced that he and his friends and his donors were dissatisfied with Biden, and they went out and tested that, and they discovered that feeling that they had was not present in their party. And not that everyone in the Democratic world is so content with Biden, but there's a recognition in 2024, as there is in 2020, that Biden is sort of the meeting point. I remain a registered Republican, and I am very cognizant of the differences between the way the parties work. The Republican Party is cohesive, compact, small and smaller. The Democratic coalition is bigger and messier and prone to breaking up at many moments. And in 2020 and 2024, Democrats recognize that whatever they themselves or their particular group within the party wished, that Biden was the point at which the gravity of the party met. He's like, you put a ball bearing in a sheet, Biden is the point where the ball bearing drags the sheet.
Well, back to the question of the Republican Party, when members of Congress and senators and governors and prominent funders and fundraisers are all saying publicly that they support Trump, when we hear so often that in private, they really deplore him. How can you hold the party together under circumstances like that?
Well, there's a tremendous irony here that there are many ironies and many comedies, but one of the great comedies of the Trump era is that the reason so many donors and activists were worried about Donald Trump is they were very aware that if he's the nominee, his plan is to steal as much of the party's money as he can and redirect it away from campaigns to his own personal expenditure, his legal bills, and actually, if he can get away with it, try to use it to satisfy some of the judgments against him. And if you're a Republican donor, this would be enraging. But there's something kind of comic about it, that one of the biggest problems that the down ballot Republicans are going to have in 2024 is a lot of the money that the Republican National Committee and the House and Senate committees would normally be spending to support candidates is just going to be stolen and either go into Trump's pocket or to lawyers' bills, or he's going to try to redirect it to his judgments. And that is money that is not going to be used to fight elections.
How can he do that so openly, as you suggest that he will, particularly now that he has his daughter-in-law on the Republican National Committee and obviously a potential funnel of money from the party to the Trump?
Well, he can do it for two reasons. The first is, and I remember doing a lot of research on this in 2016, 17. There are a lot of things that in other countries would be illegal that in the United States are not illegal because people just assume the president wouldn't do them. That, maybe you need to write a law to contain the prime minister of Belgium, but in a parliamentary system, but someone with the awesome responsibility of the presidency would, of course, just as a matter of integrity and honor, not open a hotel across the street and check whether state visitors spent the night in his hotel and put a dishonest $4,000 in his pocket. A president wouldn't do that. So it's not illegal because no one ever thought to pass a law against such a tawdry and squalid act. It's also true that at the highest levels of politics, the system is reluctant to enforce such laws as there are. And so Donald Trump has benefited both from the absence of law, and I think he's going to discover there aren't a lot of laws, and there aren't even a lot of rules preventing the RNC from redirecting money to his way. And then to the extent there are such laws, the system is very unwilling to enforce them because the American legal system is very cautious. We're seeing that with the Supreme Court, which is doing everything it can to postpone its Trump cases till after the election.
Well, what about all those Republicans that I mentioned before that are saying one thing in public and another in private? And isn't there anything they can do in private or that they might do in order to try to prevent the president from doing what you're suggesting? Stealing from the coffers of his party?
You'd think. Those of you whose minds go back to previous periods in American history, remember, there have been demagogues before in American history. There have been Joe McCarthy's, there have been others. And when such figures have appeared, the political system, although at first intimidated by them, and there was a year or two when the political system was badly intimidated by Joe McCarthy, but in the end, that people begin maneuvering and boxing the threat to the system in and taking away the threat's freedom of maneuver. And so McCarthy appears in 1950, dominates American politics in 1951 and 52, but by 53 he's on the defensive, and by 54 he's politically dead because the system has worked against him. That didn't happen with Donald Trump. Maybe because in this case the demagogue got all the way to the presidency. Maybe because he was confronted by lesser challengers. That in the end, McCarthy's greatest enemy was Dwight Eisenhower, who was a pretty canny and inventive operator, and there's been no one like that against Donald Trump. But I think there's a moral of the story that we should take away for future generations, which is, I think one of the conceits of journalism is we take people behind the scenes. We show them what politicians say in private, because we have this idea that what you say in private is the real person and what you do in public is a performance. And a lot of politicians would like that to be true too. And they imagine that that's true. But the truth is, the public self is the real self. And whatever astringent thing you may say in private, if you are subservient in public, that's the thing that matters. The real self, the public self is the real self, and the private self is just snickering.
To what extent does this have to do with the reorganization of the media or the expansion of the media into so many different outlets? We used to, in the times of Joe McCarthy and others that you've mentioned, you had three networks and a bunch of papers, and that was it. And now you have all of these different outlets, including, of course, Fox News, and so many others that are speaking to people very directly and very strongly. And
Yeah.
aren't controlled at all, aren't subject to anybody's discipline, and
Well,
consequently are circulating enormous amounts of disinformation.
and platforms. Look, if you were to say, what are the most important media companies in America? Probably the people who are watching us tonight would think, I don't know, the New York Times. But by any definition, I think the most powerful media company in America is TikTok. And it rejects the idea that it is a media company, but it is. That's how people get their information. More people get their information from any other source, to paraphrase an old advertising slogan, than get it from TikTok. And while the New York Times has a lot of impact on a certain segment of elite public opinion, and has prestige and disproportionate influence, in the end, weight and mass matter. And before TikTok, there was Facebook, and there's Reddit, and these companies really, they are the media. And one of the ways that the world has changed is, we talk about the media as if it's something different from ourselves. But if you have one of these, you're the media. You have more broadcasting power than Walter Cronkite ever had. Walter Cronkite could not send same-day video out over the air. Everything that appeared on the Walter Cronkite show, I guess he's maybe not in his last years, he's on the air till 1982, I think, but certainly through most of his career, was recorded on film that had to be developed, that had to be moved from the place the film was taken to New York and put on the air. When the Vietnam war came into your living rooms, it didn't come the same day. It came with a 3 to 5 day lag. The idea that you can instantaneously make video and send it to anyone on earth with one of these in his or her own hand, that's a new thing. And it means that when you rebroadcast something or share something, you're engaging in a publication function yourself. You are the media. We are the media.
Well, when you mentioned TikTok, the Congress has just voted to make sure that TikTok can't continue to do what it's doing if it has the same ownership that it does now, which of course is Chinese. We don't know if that's going to pass the Senate or not, but both parties seem to be in favor of it. President Biden seems to be in favor of it. The only person I've heard speak out against it is Donald Trump, who changed his mind. He was in favor of getting rid of TikTok for a long time, and now he says he's not.
The reason Rupert Murdoch is an American citizen, he was born, of course, in Australia, was that he purchased the New York Post, and I'm going to forget what year, but at some point in the 1980s. And soon after that, he began purchasing television stations. And American law at the time, whenever it was, said you could not own, in the same market, you could not own both the newspaper and the TV station unless you were also an American citizen. A foreign national could own one or the other, but not both. And Murdoch wanted to own, in the New York area, both TV and the New York Post, so he became an American citizen. Now, whenever that rule was passed, it seemed perfectly reasonable to Americans that American TV stations should be owned by Americans. I mean, they wanted the democratic authorities to have some point of aperture into the most powerful mechanism of communication that existed at the time. And it is kind of weird that the United States has allowed something that is not just a Chinese company, but a company operated by essentially the Chinese state and a hostile state, or at least an adverse state, to have so much, not only a power over what Americans consume, but so much power to gain information about Americans. I was reading today that someone, I forget who testified to this, said, if the Chinese had come along in 2014 and said, we'd like to put 100 million sensors into the United States to follow individual Americans around during their day, the United States would have said, no. But that's what in fact has happened, is everyone who has TikTok on his or her phone is carrying a sensing device controlled by the Chinese state.
So if Donald Trump says that he's no longer in favor of getting rid of TikTok in the Congress, how will that affect the Congress, do you think? And will we see any change, or will it continue as it has?
Before we get to that question about governance, I just want to drive home something, and a way to understand what Donald Trump is. I do a lot of speaking before corporate groups. and who have usually very specific interests, and many of them, these are things I'm very interested in: agriculture, mining, energy. And so I'll be in Dusseldorf or Ottawa, and somebody say, what would a second Trump term mean for the mining industry or Canadian wheat or British mining interests? And because there is this desire, this need to live in an orderly universe where a Donald Trump presidency bears some resemblance to presidencies as we've known them in the past, whether you like them or didn't like them. And I don't think we quite take on board just how freakish and bizarre the whole Trump episode is. I mean, Trump is an authoritarian figure, but before he's an authoritarian, he's a crook. And before he's a crook, he's a head case. And so Donald Trump is uniquely susceptible to bribes, and pretty small bribes, given considering what he's given away. I mean, it's the power of the United States, and he's selling it for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes single millions. But not even as not sell. I mean, at least his son-in-law has some grandeur. His son-in-law sells it out for billions. Well, at least that's a person with vision. But above all, he's a head case, because in many of these cases, he's doing it just for compliments, which is pathetic.
Okay, so there it is. On the other hand, why do you think it is that so many people are supportive of him? I know in Trumpocalypse, your most recent book, 2020, what's being said about that book is that it suggests that a huge swath of Americans have put their faith in Trump because they see the rest of the country building a future that doesn't have a place for them. Can you elaborate on that idea?
Well, I would estimate that somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of Americans are strongly committed to Donald Trump. The real Trump base is about a fifth to a quarter of the electorate. But Donald Trump has bootstrapped that because we have this powerful force of negative partisanship. You know, if we were doing this conversation in 30 years ago in the 1990s, what we would be talking about if we were alert to the polls is the decline in party identification in the United States. Whereas once America was 40% Democrat and 33% Republican, that was true from Vietnam through the Reagan administration, that began to decline quite steeply in the 1990s. And we talked about the rise of the independent voter. And the assumption was made is the independent voter was a centrist voter, and the independent voter was someone in between the two parties, and the two parties were weakening and the middle was growing. That turned out obviously to be quite wrong. And what we didn't understand was that the independent voter was actually on the outer edge of the two parties. The independents were more extreme than the registered people. And that the independent voters weren't moderate at all. And they weren't even that independent. What they were people who didn't necessarily like either of the parties, but had a party they disliked. And the political scientists who began to measure this coined the phrase negative polarization, that we were defined not by what we supported, the way people were in a different time, but by what we opposed. And so once you can bootstrap your 25 or whatever it is % of the electorate into control of one of the other parties, you can use the animosity that the party loyalists have to the other party to corral the votes of people who don't necessarily like you very much. And Donald Trump's problem is he's not as popular as his partisans would have people make out, but his great advantage is that may not matter, because he can mobilize their negative feelings as a tool of power.
The subtitle of your first book, Trumpocracy, in 2018, is The Corruption of the American Public. Why did you choose that title, and what does it have to do with the idea that people see the rest of the country building a future that doesn't have a place for them?
Yeah. There has been a kind of degradation of standards of responsibility. But right now, the Congress of the United States is putting a kind of embargo on aid to Ukraine and to other allies as well, but especially to Ukraine, which needs it the most. And we are going to witness probably a democratic society at risk of being overwhelmed by an authoritarian, aggressive neighbor, which the United States could easily help, but which the United States won't because of the vanity and ego and mysterious but certainly sinister connections between the head of the Republican Party and the head of the Russian state. And there's something there that this was the nightmare of the founding fathers, that there would be corrupt influence by foreign powers in the United States. You know, when the United States Constitution was written, the United States was not the strongest power in the Western Hemisphere. That was Great Britain. It wasn't the second strongest power in the Western Hemisphere. That was Spain. It wasn't the third strongest power. That was France.
Right.
And the United States was maybe, there are many of the Indian confederacies that still exist in the 1780s that probably could put more fighting men under arms than the early American Republic was. So maybe it wasn't even fourth, maybe it was fifth. And the founders were terrified of corrupt foreign influence inside their new republic. And a lot of the Constitution was written to keep that out. I mean, the emoluments clause we heard so much about, but other things too, that they were haunted, and it comes up again and again in the Federalist Papers. They'd seen, and this was not something they just read about it in Latin and Greek, although they did. They had seen in their day the Polish Republic, which was ripped apart between 1774 and 1792, destroyed by corrupt influence by more powerful neighbors. They'd seen the Swedish kingdom, which was, again, a big deal in the 1600s and lost power in the 1700s, torn apart because of systematic corruption of its elites by neighbors. They'd seen the snuffing out. That wouldn't happen in 1797. The Venetian Republic, the oldest continuing republic on earth, was snuffed out. So this was real life to them, that powerful neighbors could corrupt Republican leaders. And they tried to prevent that from happening. And by and large, their design worked. It worked until 2016, and then it stopped working.
Why did it stop?
It stopped because we became less vigilant. It stopped because negative partisanship overwhelmed a lot of the institutional defenses. It stopped because 200 plus years is a pretty good run for anything, and eventually, every burglar alarm does sooner or later fail. And I don't think we should look at these inheritances from the past as things simply to dust and keep on trophy cases and admire. They require constant updating and upgrading and modernization. So I would say it's not so much that the system failed us as that we failed the system.
There have been a lot of stories recently about what various heads of state are saying about each other. And one of them has to do with former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who described Donald Trump's interactions with Vladimir Putin this way. He says, quote, "When you see Trump with Putin, as I have on a few occasions, he's like the 12-year-old boy who goes to high school and meets the captain of the football team, my hero," close quote. He goes on to say, quote, "That is really creepy." What does it do for the United States when a head of state or a former head of state from another country says something like that about the man who's running for president on the re-election for president of the United States?
That needs to be stressed here that Malcolm Turnbull is, of course, a center-right politician. He's a former investment banker. He is someone who's done a lot of business in some dangerous places in the world. He is a very worldly person, and he's someone who is not ideologically necessarily super hostile to what Donald Trump purports to believe. So when he says these things, he's saying them from a position of, a potential sympathizer with Donald Trump's nominal politics, but who's aghast by the man. I think everyone has seen this, and especially since 2022 and the Russian drive on Kiev, that we are confronting major Russian aggression. And you have this president who has this strange infatuation with Putin. And it's much stronger with Putin than with anybody else, but he has this love of dictators. And he has this openness to being corrupted by dictators. I mean, the flip-flop on TikTok is really remarkable. That Trump, as president, said negative things about TikTok, but he's gotten a big contribution from the American hedge fund owner, invests heavily in the holding company that controls TikTok. And so Donald Trump has changed his mind. And as I said earlier, what is sort of pathetic is sometimes he just does it for flattery. He doesn't even get an actual check out of it. He just does it because of his ego needs.
Let me ask you about another question that's going to come up in the campaign for sure, and that's immigration and the crisis at the border. Former President Trump effectively vetoed a bipartisan agreement to deal with it. You have written that by doing that, he has empowered the president of Mexico, López Obrador, to determine whether the crisis continues. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I'm going to put an egg timer on myself here because I am obsessed with Mexican politics, but I'm very conscious of the saying that Americans will do anything for Mexico except read about it. And at the Atlantic, we get very detailed metrics on all of our work. The Atlantic has been kind enough to send me to Mexico a couple of times and let me write about Mexico at length. But I have to admit, I think these are pretty good articles, in my opinion, and yet they are by far the least read things I've done. In fact,
Well, you can talk about them now. I'll give you a chance to
I'm
do
going to talk about them now with this captive audience. So uh, just look at the map. Mexico controls access to the southern frontier of the United States. I was in Mexico in January, in the southwestern part of the country, and saw roadblocks on the northbound Pan American Highway where they would stop and interrogate cars. I also saw that those roadblocks were there for just a couple of hours a day because they weren't altogether all that serious about it. The Mexicans have a lot of authority about whether there's more migration from the Guatemalan border to the United States border or not. Just to put this in context, by the way, the income gap between the United States and Mexico is about 3-1. The income gap between Mexico and Guatemala is about 10-1. So the pressure is much greater on the Mexico-Guatemala border than it is on the Mexico-US border. And how Mexico chooses to respond determines the degree of crisis in the immigration situation in the United States. Lopez Obrador, who became president of Mexico in 2018, whose term ends, well, there's an election in June of 2024, and his term ends in October of 2024. Is commonly described as a left of center candidate, but he is strongly pro-Trump and strongly anti-Biden. He is, I don't want to describe this as a deal because that suggests there's some kind of quid pro quo or handshake. But going into his election in June, where Lopez Obrador hopes to hand over power to a chosen successor, who is, by the way, a woman with the name of Claudia Sheinbaum, and she is of Jewish heritage, which is would be a bigger deal if she didn't always campaign in a crucifix. He hopes to hand over power to her, and he hopes the United States will then look the other way from his systematic destruction of Mexican democratic institutions in order to do this handover. So what he has done, beginning around the turn of the year, is dial back the flow of immigration. The United States, the border crossings have been much less in January and February and now in March than they were in the last 3 months of 2023. So this is a big win for the Biden administration, and it's a signal that he can make their problems be less severe if they in turn help him with his problem, which is to hand over powers to his chosen successor. The risk is, will he honor the deal? Because once he gets past June 2nd and creates an election in which his chosen successor gets a mandate one way or the other, then he doesn't need anything more from the United States. His chosen successor will take power in October, and both of them would much rather have a Trump presidency than a Biden presidency. So the risk is very great that it's quiet on the border until June, when the United States can raise a voice. And then once it's too late, there's crisis in July, August, and September.
guaranteeing that it will be an issue in the election.
Lopez Obrador has the power. He can ensure that you have record crossings and hundreds of thousands of people, or he can dial it back so you don't have record crossings.
I'm bouncing around from subject to subject, and I want to do that and soon go to questions from the audience, many of which are very interesting and very good. But I want to ask you about the Biden administration in Gaza. President Biden has said that Prime Minister Netanyahu is hurting Israel more than he's helping it. Just today, Samantha Power, the head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, said in a public forum that when she visited Israel, she told Netanyahu to improve compliance with international humanitarian law. Is that the right message at this point?
It's not certainly the message that I would care to hear, but I focus on the extraordinary level of support the Biden administration has given Israel as it defends itself and tries to ensure that there are no future October 7th. And I would just note, if your mind runs back this far, that in previous defensive wars by Israel, maybe the closest parallel to this one is October of 1982 war in Lebanon. The PLO struck Israel. They assassinated the Israeli ambassador in London, and they unleashed a campaign of terror in the northern parts of the country. And Israel responded and was given just weeks before the United States said, that's enough, no more. Israel is never allowed to fight these wars to the end. The Biden administration has given Israel more support for more time than any American administration has ever given an Israeli government doing such a war. Because Israel's enemies fight from civilian inhabited areas, these wars always have very tragic side effects. That's not Israel's choice. That's the choice of the people who choose to locate their armies inside civilian populations, but the consequence is the consequence. And usually it's had a it's meant that the patience of the world for Israel's self-defense has been limited. The Biden administration's patience has been much greater than any seen. There's a flow of supplies and information and technology has been very great. Inevitably, there's a clock. The time does run out. It does sound like the time is running out now, but it's been an amazingly long run. And I hope that Israel has made the best use of that time that it possibly can to achieve its objectives of securing peace for its people.
President Netanyahu, excuse me, Prime Minister Netanyahu says that in order to win this war, he's going to have to attack Rafah. The Israelis have driven the Palestinians into Rafah, and now they're looking at a potential invasion there. Can he attack Rafah and improve compliance with international humanitarian law at the same time?
Well, you're way outside my bounds of expertise here. What is being recommended to Netanyahu by the Americans is that they do much more targeted and specific and special forces kind of operations. Is that feasible? I have no idea. That's something I don't know anything about. The United States has, at least the Biden administration has again and again mused about could you do this in some more highly targeted way? I have no competence to evaluate whether that's possible. If possible, it would be good. The Israelis don't do it, which lends me to think it may just not, we may be talking here about wish casting, not about real world strategy, real world tactics, but I don't know. That is outside my area.
Let me go to chat where people are leaving potential questions and try to answer as quickly as you can so I can get in more questions. I've waited a long time to go to the list. Martha wants to know, you had a one-on-one with Steve Bannon. What do you think is in his mind now? If Trump wins, what role do you think he might have?
Look, all the people around Trump are confronted with real legal jeopardy. Bannon got a pardon from Trump, but one of the great defense lawyers of Washington, criminal defense lawyer, says his message to his clients when he wins their cases: "Don't let me see you in this office again." The problem with the Trump people is they keep coming back to they get away with one crime, or they get a pardon, they get an acquittal, and then they come back and they do more crimes. So I don't know that Bannon will be Trump's chosen tool next time, because Bannon does have a lot of opinions and ideas of his own. I think Trump is going to have a very specific agenda should he return to power, and it's very much about retaliation and retribution for the events of 2020 and about creating legal impunity for himself. I'm not sure Bannon would be the guy he would work with.
Robert wants to know, will you discuss how Trump's choice for his vice president may affect the election?
I assume the Trump choice will be sub-rational, impulsive, but he will be looking above all for a creature that Mike Pence in the end showed too much independence. I think there's a lot of political science that suggests your choice of a vice president really doesn't matter to the ticket. Lyndon Johnson in 1960 may have been the rare exception on the plus side. Sarah Palin in 2008 may have been the rare exception on the negative side, but usually it doesn't matter. What you're choosing when you choose a vice president is a next president. You're giving someone in your party a leg up in his or her hope to be a president after you. That's the way a thoughtful decision maker should approach the question. Trump's anything but.
Let me just remind those who aren't aware of it, because we forgot to mention it, that you can ask questions on chat, and hopefully you will. We have some good questions already, but we can always use more. Arnold wants to know, how concerned are you about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Taking votes from Biden and helping to elect Trump?
I'm pretty concerned about that, not because I necessarily think that he's going to take more votes from Biden than he does from Trump, but I think every vote taken from Trump is a good deed, and every vote taken from Biden is a bad deed. And so I'm more concerned about bad deeds than good deeds. Kennedy is, again, obviously a kind of head case. He's also an example of something that I find quite fascinating, which is it doesn't seem obvious why, if you're an anti-vax crackpot, why you also have to be a simp for Putin's Russia. Those seem like two completely different manias that have nothing in common one with each other. And yet it's just amazing how these manias, like magnets, pull together, and you are an anti-vax crackpot, so you become a simp for Russia. It's like those in the olden days when if you subscribe to Good Housekeeping, they gave you Sports Illustrated almost for free. It's like a magazine rack of craziness. And the most interesting thing to me about Robert Kennedy Jr. is how all the craziness has come together. And I'm not going to pretend I understand why that is, but I'm sure many of you have observed with friends and loved ones that it does seem to be true. Crazinesses merge.
Do you think that he is a real threat to President Biden?
Look, there are no votes to spare. I am not going to do I can't do the punditry of where the gravity is. But I just think with it's such a consequential election. Risks are dangerous. Third party candidates can have very unpredictable effects. We're still arguing all these years later whether Ross Perot took more votes from George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton. I mean, one would have thought a thing like that would be known at this great point in history, this great distance in history, and yet the political scientists still argue who did Perot hurt more.
A lot of questions about you and the Republican Party. And Mark wants to know, as a Republican, do you see a path for your party to return to previous values in place of Trumpism? And may I ask as well, are you still in fact a Republican? Can you be in that party given what's happened to it with President Trump at the head?
I'm a registered Republican in the District of Columbia. It's a tiny and exclusive club. I remain a Republican for two big reasons. The first is I feel a sense of responsibility that you can't just walk. This is part of my life story. I've been writing a political memoir over the past 3 or 4 years. With the loss of my daughter, this becomes very more intense to try to do a reckoning for my own life, what I have believed, why I believed it, what I am proud of, what I am not, where I feel culpable, where I feel like I did my best. Really reckoning with the choices of one's life. But I made this bed, so I have to lie in it. And if the bed is disgusting, I have to clean it. And I can't just say it's somebody else's problem. So that's one reason. The second is there remain all, I mean, if I were 40 years younger, I would move to California and become active in the California Republican Party, because in the great knowledge center states, there need to be people who say things like budgets have to be balanced. Taxes can be destructive. Criminals belong in prison. It's important that there be streets where people can walk and stroll, and dogs can go, and mothers with children, and not feel afraid because they're intimidated by people who look to them like intimidating people. I mean, there are just a lot of things. There's a lot of reasons that God put conservatives on earth to do. And I don't say that conservatives are the only people who are right, but there's this. We all have our rules. That there are times when society needs to be reminded, be more generous, try some new ideas. And other times when society needs to be told things like, well, money doesn't grow on trees. And sometimes the answer is no. And we each have our role. So if I were not in the District of Columbia, but living in the kind of state I would be living in if I weren't, I would down ballot support most of the Republican approaches to most of the issues of law and order and public finance.
Interesting that in California, liberal that it is politically, hasn't elected a Republican since Arnold Schwarzenegger a long time ago. There are apparently more Republicans than there are in any other state. That's how big California is.
Right. But somebody needs to say, $250,000 a year for a prison guard seems kind of high, doesn't it? And someone needs to be saying that. And you need you need an effective two-party system, because what you get if you don't, and California is an example of this, if you don't have parties, you have factions. And the difference in party politics and faction politics is party politics is highly legible to people who don't pay enormous attention. The typical person has a pretty good idea of what a Republican is and what a Democrat is. But which Democrat is a business Democrat and which is a progressive Democrat, that's a much more complicated problem. And so what you're effectively doing when you move from party politics to faction politics is you're making the print a lot smaller and challenging people to put on their reading glasses, if they happen to have them, to read who is in which subgroup and cast an intelligent vote. That becomes very, very hard to do.
You, of course, wrote speeches for George W. Bush. You wrote a book about him called The Right Man. Stuart wants to know, knowing President George W. Bush as you do, at some point, will his commitment to our democracy outweigh his preference to stay out of presidential politics so that he will ultimately speak out against Donald Trump?
Well, he did give one of the most memorable Trump quotes of them all when he said on Inauguration Day about the Trump address, "That was some weird shit." And I think this fantasy that the next volume of the Oxford History of America, which they're publishing in 12 volumes, will be some weird shit, America in the Trump years. But Bush has a very specific problem on speaking out. His presidency ended with the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. I personally believe that was one of the great hours in American government. The fact that that crisis did not turn into a Great Depression, did not turn into what happened in 1932, 33, and the degree of cooperation that ensued between the outgoing Bush administration and the incoming Obama administration, it's the finest transition in American history. And in the course of that transition, Bush and Obama and their families built a very close, really quite intimate personal friendship. Yeah. So when Obama became president, became so anathema to Republicans, Bush needed an explanation as to why he never criticized Obama. And he said, I owe my successor my silence. So he made it a principle. I'm not going to criticize my successors. So as a party figure, he has this problem. He never said anything about Obama. If he now criticized Trump, Republicans would say, wait a minute, we sort of suspect that you like Obama, and you, especially your wife, likes Michelle, and your daughters get along, but we don't like him, and we think you should have criticized him. And you're not going to criticize him, but you are going to criticize the guy we like. So there's a very specific problem that George Bush has, which I think will inhibit him. But the some weird shit quote will live forever.
Yeah, but won't he have to, or doesn't he have an obligation, it seems to me, to speak out, given all of the things that you said about Trump and the risks that he poses to our country? And I think we haven't said this specifically, but the risk to democracy itself.
Well, I would if I were in his shoes, but I'm not. I would have done different things if I were in Mitch McConnell's shoes. But when I look at Republicans who I think really Mitch McConnell had much more power to do things than an ex-president of 2 terms had. Bush has maybe some authority, maybe some popularity, maybe not, but Mitch McConnell really had the keys, and other Republicans have had them. So look, there's, I think, a failure of Republicans to act more decisively. I think on the list of people who let down their country, I would not put George W. Bush in the top 25 of those. I think he was not as well positioned as some others to really make a difference.
Gord wants to know, initial polls show that Biden hasn't gained any points after his fiery State of the Union speech. I thought he would gain 2 or 3 points at least. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, look, I don't want to sound like a mystic here. But I'm talking to a California audience, or a California-based audience. You're all movie viewers. I assume we've all seen The Godfather.
We get people from all over the world.
Well, you know the opening scene of The Godfather, I believe in America. It's the opening line. So I'm going to say, I'm just not going to believe. I'm not going to believe that America is going to do this to itself or the rest of the world. I am just going to insist on believing until I'm proven wrong that Americans will do the right thing. Whatever the polls say, and whatever hesitancy there is about Biden for whatever reason, some of them not of his making. I just note that because of inflation, every Democratic head of government everywhere is unpopular. Rishi Sunak is unpopular in the United Kingdom, and Justin Trudeau is in Canada. And there are always specific reasons, but the basic fact is groceries cost more, and wages have gone up too, but people are not as sensitized to the wage bucket is general. The grocery bill is very specific, and people don't like it. No one's seen inflation of any degree since the late 1970s. You know, it's a novel environment. My late father was a successful businessman, and he ended his careers by sitting on the boards of a number of companies, and some of them with very dynamic figures, 30, 40, 50 years younger than himself. And I said, what's your role on this board? He said, I have one role on the board, which is to, whenever anybody has an idea, to say, what if interest rates go up 2 points? And they all look at me like I'm crazy, like interest rates don't go up, interest rates go down. That's the only, because if you were, 40 in 2016, you'd never seen an interest rate do anything but go down. I mean, sometimes it went up a little bit for a brief period, but then they went down and down and down, and then they hit 0, and then they couldn't go down anymore. And we are now living in a world in which we discover, you mean I have to pay money for this mortgage? It's not free. I liked it when it was free, and people don't like it when it's not free.
Here's Eric, who wants you to know, he is from LA. He says, do you think a second term with Trump would be pro-Israel? Why do you think he doesn't talk more about the Middle East today?
Um, so I think the second Trump term would be more rhetorically pro-Israel. It would give more space for Israel to use force when it wanted to. But Israel doesn't just need permission. It needs a larger structure of security. And that Israel has to find Israel's most important strategic problems are with its more powerful neighbors. And they have to find ways to really live as neighbors with countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the others. And all of that takes a powerful American presence. What a second Trump term would mean most fundamentally for foreign policy is that the whole idea of the American back order would go. You know, we live, I don't think we appreciate this enough because we've taken it for granted for so long, but we live, like you go into a store in Thailand and you get ripped off. You call Visa and you complain in English and they will fix it for you. And that is world government. And that rests on treaties and agreements and banking institutions, but ultimately it rests on American power. That's why Visa can solve your problem in a shop in Thailand. It's the American Navy that polices all the waterways of the world. And Trump thinks this is a problem. Trump is this, but there, you know, after World War II, there was a reason when the United States said to Germany, you know, as good as you are at armies, you're not going to have one anymore. We'll do that for you. And to the Japanese, as good as you are at navies, you're not going to have that. You guys focus on pleasing consumers, making great products, innovating and commercially, and delivering generous welfare states to your people. You leave the Army and Navy business to us. That was not a bug in the post-1945 system. That was a feature, because we don't want 8 navies patrolling the Straits of Malacca. We just want one to do it. And even like the Indonesians and the Australians and the Indians, they are very glad to have the United States Navy doing it. And when the United States turns inward, it doesn't lead to other people stepping up. It leads to chaos and competition. So, and the smaller democracies are the most vulnerable, and I include Israel in that. So yeah, Trump would give Israel more leeway to use the most heavy-handed tactics against Gaza. That's true, more than Biden has done. But it wouldn't wrap Israel in the network of agreements and collective security that Israel needs. Remember, Israel's most important trading partners are in the European Union, not the United States. It needs that relationship to work too. And all of that depends on an American world order of peace and security and free trade and American exporting security to other people, which we will lose if there's a second Trump term.
Thank you for being able to bounce around as effectively as you do. Carol wants to know, if Trump gets reelected, what happens to NATO?
NATO's dead, because the president doesn't need to withdraw from NATO. What NATO ultimately is, and NATO's they got a big office building in Brussels, and they've got all these institutions. But what NATO ultimately is a promise by the United States that it will use nuclear weapons to defend its partners if need be. And there is one person in the world who makes the nuclear decision. It's not made by a committee. It's not made by Congress. In nuclear weapons, the United States is an absolute monarchy. It's the president. So if the president makes it clear, I'm not going to defend Estonia. I don't care what the treaty says. I don't have to dissolve it. I'm just not going to defend Estonia. Sorry. Then Estonia is out of NATO and NATO is dead. And so his non-action will kill NATO, and will kill it within 5 minutes.
Tom wants to know, is defense of democracy a useful campaign appeal, even if it's true?
Look, so I'm not a Democrat here, and it's hard for me sometimes to understand the Democratic Party. It's a big, sprawling mess, which needs lots of messages for lots of people. President Biden showed this in the State of the Union, that the kind of thing that activates the loyal Democrat who may or may not show up is very different from the kind of thing that activates me and Ann Romney and all the people who've been casting Republican ballots all our lives, but are going to make an exception this time to put Biden over the top. So there's the base, and then there's the frosting. And the base and the frosting respond to different messages. And they don't like the same messages. But so he needs the message for his base, which is about the bread and butter issues that have demobilized a lot of especially younger Democrats who find housing difficult to afford and find it hard to start families, who are burdened by student debt. That's one message. But he's not going to win this election with just for Democrats. He's going to win it with the votes of a lot of people who don't normally vote Democratic. And for us, the defense of democracy is everything. That's what's going to make, I think, every single adult member of the Romney family vote for Biden. Is not by the issues that you talked about at the State of the Union, but the defense of democracy both at home and abroad.
Are you, and particularly other Republicans who might be voting Democratic for the first time, do you think that President Biden should debate with Donald Trump?
By the way, I voted Democratic in 2016, so it's not.
I beg your pardon. Okay.
Not a virgin on this question, but and 2016 was. I took a long time to think that over. 2020 was easy. I'd broken the habit, so I would take a highly pragmatic approach. I think I would consult with polls. I think Biden should do what he needs to do in order to get an advantage. If it's better for him not to debate, don't. I think with when you're dealing with such a ruthless system breaker as Donald Trump, you don't play by the rules of the game. You're just a sap if you do that. So Trump didn't debate his opponents in the primary. He thought it was to his advantage, and so Biden should do what is to his advantage. I don't know what that is, but there are people around him who will be able to come up with some pretty good data on what it is, and whatever that is, he should do that. Gerald
wants to know, is it conceivable that if Trump, unfortunately, as he said, might win, could he manipulate the situation into a third, fourth term even more?
Well, we do reckon with the tragedy of human mortality here, more tragic in some cases than others. He'll be pretty old by the time the third term comes around. I think he will be able to do so much damage in the first or second year of the next. And I think people are not understanding also the kind of chaos, because a second Trump term is probably going to have Democrats in control of at least one House of Congress right away. I mean, I think if you were betting right now, you would say it's possible. I would say 4 chances out of 10 that Trump wins, 6 chances out of 10 that Biden wins. Probably the Republicans take the Senate. Very probably the Democrats take the House. So what happens when a second-term Trump starts pardoning himself, starts firing prosecutors, starts saying laws don't apply to me, the president doesn't have to pay civil damages, like starts smashing the whole framework of the American legal system for his own selfish benefit? And there's a Democratic House of Representatives. Are they going to sit there and say, well, you said the Harry Potter cheat code, I guess we have to put up with it? No, they're going to impeach him. We're going to have a third impeachment crisis. And if the Republicans do win the House of Representatives and Trump is the president, we're going to have people in the streets. It's going to be like Tel Aviv 9 months ago with hundreds of thousands of people in all kinds of cities. Trump isn't going to have an open field. He's going to want to do some terrible things, but he's also going to be contending with massive resistance inside and outside the political system.
There is a tradition on this program, which has been going for a long time, as I've indicated at the outset, that when we come to the end, we have a couple of minutes left. We always like to ask the guest if there's something positive you can leave us with, particularly given some of the things that you've said, which have been, I think, pessimistic in many ways.
I am not pessimistic. I've said things I'm hoping to drive home the gravity of the situation. I am not a pessimist, neither in the micro sense about what I think will happen. I'm also not a pessimist in that, look, be grateful to be alive at a time when your country needs you. That everything I have said that is alarming or upsetting is also your opportunity to be a good citizen, to be a good American, to do something that's right and good that you can be proud of in your civic life. And I think God sent Trump to the United States as both a reminder and a test. He's a humbling agent. When 40, 50 years from now, when the children open the school books, when Italian children open their school books, they have to confront one of the prime ministers of Italy was Mussolini. When German children open their school books, they have to confront their history. In the United States, Americans can be a little arrogant, can think that they are somehow exempt from the normal tragedies of the human race. There's going to be Donald Trump's face in the history books to remind you, you are made of the same stuff as everybody else. You are not better. You just were luckier, and you had good institutions, but you didn't always take care of them. And this is what you got. So be humble. But he's also a reminder of what people are able to do. And he's a summons. I think there was, in those prosperous, easy years after the end of the Cold War, a kind of mood of complacency in the United States, and Donald Trump was the beneficiary of it. So what I would say that is less positive than it is more hopeful and urgent. Say, believe in yourself, believe in the value of what you do, believe in the value. Thank you for being here. I mean, the very act of being here is a tremendous act of citizenship. And now go activate others to be citizens like you. You are needed. This is your opportunity. Everything that happens is going to be up to you. And the next time somebody says, I don't like the choice that I'm being offered in 2024, say, this isn't a show. This isn't a beauty pageant. This isn't a dog show. These are not people for you to judge and say, I like this one, I don't like that one. This is your country. This is not about them. It's about you. It's about who you are. What are you? What are you made of? Will you be there early? Will you drive somebody to the polls? Will you speak out? Will you be unafraid? So my positive message is one of, it's an honor to do the things that we need to do over the next few months.
Well, David Frum, it's been an honor to have you on our program. You've dealt with so many topics in so much detail and with so much insight. Thank you very much once again. We're just delighted to have you, and I hope we will, in fact, come back again and be on America at a Crossroads. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Next week, March 20th, we're going to have the CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt. He'll be on with Larry Mantle. They'll be talking about anti-Semitism, hate, and bigotry in America today, and update. Listen then, and in the meantime, have a good night tonight and stay safe.